in the chat box or raise a hand in the function, the function in the Zoom. Also, please note that the event will be recorded and made available in our YouTube channel and used on various social media channels. Thank you very much. Magda?
Hello, everyone. We are the master and PhD student working on the Caucasus, and our main topic is on the archaeological part, historical, medieval times, linguistic. This is the main purpose, and also we are bringing the new researchers who are working in the field of Caucasus, such as archaeologists, as I mentioned already, anthropologists, ethnographers, etc. And if you would like to join our upcoming seminars and would like to share your research, please feel free and get in touch. Mariam?
Thank you, Magda. Hello, everybody. And let me present a short introduction to our today's event. So our first speaker is Walter Crist, a postdoctoral researcher at Maastricht University. We'll be speaking about the playing through time, board games in the Caucasus region from Antiquity to 20th century, which will be followed by a short QA. Then our second speaker is James Baillie, a PhD researcher at the University of Vienna, who will be speaking about the imagined borders, the medieval Caucasus through structured data. Our moderator is Abby Robinson, a PhD researcher at the University of Melbourne. And let me introduce Abby to you. She's as I already mentioned, PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. Her dissertation is based on data from an extensive archaeological survey in the Samtskhe-Javakheti region of southwestern Georgia. She also studying material culture. She incorporates both ancient texts and gives spatial analysis into her work. She is also currently involved in an epidoc project with the University of Hamburg, coding inscriptions from Asia Minors for publications. So I'll leave the floor to Abby. Abby, please, you can continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam. Thanks very much. We're starting today with Walter Crist. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and he obtained his PhD in anthropology from Arizona State University in 2016. And his research focuses on ancient games as they relate to social processes such as long-distance exchange and social city. He's the leader of the book Ancient Egyptians at Play, Board Games Across Borders, and he's performed games research in Cyprus, Azerbaijan, Greece, Turkey, and the Netherlands. And as Mariam said, the title of his presentation is Playing Through Time, Board Games in the Caucasus region from Antiquity to the 20th Century. So I'll hand you over now to Walter, and then at the end of his paper we'll have 5 minutes for some questions. So over to you, Walter.
Great, thank you so much, Abby, and thanks to everybody for coming and to the whole Caucasus Through Time team for organizing this. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about an artificial intelligence, digital humanities, meets archaeology and history project based here at Maastricht University. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what the project is. Our project is kind of focused worldwide, but I'll zero in toward the end of the project about some examples of the things that we've worked on as it relates to the Caucasus, and kind of hopefully asking everybody here if they have any more information that they could maybe contribute. So basically, our project is focused on studying traditional games from around the world, from the earliest ones that we can document up to the present day. So when I say traditional games, these are things that these are kinds of games that you learn growing up, right? So we're focusing mainly on board games, and nowadays people kind of learn games in a different way than they traditionally have around the world and in the past. So now in a Western society, you kind of just go to the store, buy a game that you want to play, and you find the rules there written down in the box, and then you learn it from reading the rules. But this is not how games have been played for the most of human history. Games have been taught from person to person. You learn it from your parents when you grow up, or you learn it from siblings or your friends, or from someone who came from a faraway place, or you teach them a game from your own culture, and it travels through time and across space through this kind of person-to-person interaction. And that's what's unique about these kinds of traditional games, and we'll see why that presents challenges and opportunities for us in the next few slides. But often the way that games are played, games can often be placed in a specific context because you have a group of people who then kind of play a game in a similar way. So you can kind of, bound it in a way in certain regions and times. And these games are typically not invented for sale or for kind of intellectual, challenging, what the possibilities of games are. These are kinds of phenomena that appear in the Western world in the 20th century, or not the 20th, the 19th century, maybe a little bit before that. Where you get the commercialization of games and things like that, that kind of has changed the way that we experience games in a way, but it's different from the traditional way of playing games. So the Digital Looting Project is the project that I'm working on. It's funded by the European Research Council and led by Cameron Brown, a computer scientist and games designer. It focuses on lootemes, which I'll talk about specifically in a little more detail what they are, but they're kind of the building blocks of games, the ideas of things that you do during a game that when you combine them all, it makes a game. And so what we're going to do is, what we are doing is drawing from historical and archaeological and artistic and ethnographic evidence to document these games from all around the world, and use artificial intelligence to model and preserve the knowledge of the games from the past, to reconstruct missing knowledge where it has not been preserved, and to also map the transmission of games from all across the world. So lootemes are they're like a game meme. So it's it's a piece of information about the game that is transmitted from one person to another, and for the kind of transmission part of it, but it's also just a simple idea about the game. So it can be, the size of the board, or the number of players, or the number of pieces each player has. Does it have dice or not? Is there a starting position? What's the winning condition? All of these different things add up when you put them all together, make a game. But individually, we call them lootemes. And so what really enables this project to go forward is that Cameron Brown, the leader of our project, invented this ludemic game description language, which you see over here on the right. I apologize, it's a little blurry, but so the kind of the industry standard of game description languages is not really human readable. It's very much, coding language that is not very intuitive to an untrained eye. But this language that has been invented uses the concept of lootemes to add them all together to make a game. So you have here the game tic-tac-toe, which has 2 players. The equipment is a square board of 3 by 3 square. Player 1 has a disc, player 2 has a cross. The rules are that to play, you add to an empty space on the board, one of your pieces, and the end is if you have a line 3, the one who moved last wins. So the way that this is constructed allows for for us to identify when lootings are missing and other kinds of things so that we can compare games more quantifiably. So the software that we're doing this in is called Looty. It's a general game system, which means that it can handle any kind of board game that you throw at it, basically. We have 1,000 in our traditional games database, but we have more modern games that don't fit the criteria of the project, but the game software can handle them. Can also handle cards, it can handle dominoes, but we haven't really focused on that yet. And what's good about it is it also provides a platform for artificial intelligence to play the games and to analyze and produce quantifiable results and metrics that we can look at for analysis. So you can download and play this now. The website is there. I'll also have it at the end. So to construct this, to identify what it is that we have as far as information is for these ancient games, we've had to construct a database of what these games are and what it is that we know about them. Because remember, these traditional games have been passed from person to person, and therefore the rules for these games have very rarely been written down. So we have to infer what the rules are from either artifacts that we find or artistic depictions of people playing these games or allusions to them in texts, or that can either be historical texts or even in literature where they use a metaphor of a game to illustrate something that's happening in the narrative. Our focus is worldwide, so we have games from all continents except for Australia. So if anyone has a traditional Australian game, please let me know. And we're starting from the earliest documented game thing that we can call a board game up to the present. So that's around 3500 BCE. And all of we are taking all of this information from primary sources about the game. So, the artifacts, the literature, something that provides a piece of information from that culture and from the time that the game was played that tells us something about the rules. And in addition to being able to do the kind of AI research that we want to do on this, it also provides a resource for people who want to study games on their own, because all of this has been very kind of dispersed and hard to come by and requires a lot of searching. So it's now, a lot of this is in a database that can be used by people who want to research games. So as I kind of mentioned before, the evidence consists of these pieces of information about games that we can gather from all different kinds of sources. And ideally, a piece of evidence will provide some kind of information about the rules. So for instance, an artifact that is found in an archaeological dig will tell us what the board shape or size is. If we have a text, say we have some texts from Egypt, for example, that mention that the game of Senet is a journey through the afterlife, and that certain spaces that are marked on the boards are bad or good spaces. So we know things about the games from these kinds of things. But also in more recent times, we have things like full on rules texts that have described the full sets of rules, or ethnographic accounts where someone has gone to some other culture and written about the games from there and kind of documented what the rules are. These give us kind of a snapshot of what these games are like in a specific time and place. And so we need the chronological and spatial data to be able to connect games to one another. So all the evidence that we gather has to have some kind of geographical and chronological component to it, to the data. And often this data will be the data, particularly the rules data that we have that we're able to collect, are incomplete. So that means we have to kind of fill in the holes, we will talk about in a little bit. So the database, as you can see here, and the link is right there. We currently have this screenshot is a little bit out of date. We have 1,007 games now. So our goal was to reach 1,000 games in the database for analysis. So we have surpassed that now. And just to zoom in on one of the games. So if you go to the page for one of the games, this is the game of 58 holes, which was popular in the ancient Near East and Egypt. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the game as it relates to the Caucasus. But it's just, you have a picture of the board as it appears in the software, a short description of what the game is, kind of, you know, where it was played, during what time, you know, who played it, what do we know about it, and then what we know about the rules down at the bottom there. And then scrolling down from there, oh, I skipped. Anyway, scrolling down from there, you see we have a map of the evidence that we have collected for this game. So the dots on the map here are, you know, places where an artifact or something else has been found, and or where it originated from, and the orange regions are for things that we can't pin down to a specific site, but we can kind of attribute it to a certain region. And it shows us at the top that the evidence for this game ranges from 2200 BCE up to 301. And then at the bottom, we have a bunch of sources listed there. I'll talk about that in a second. You can zoom in on the map and click on an individual point there. So this one is from Azerbaijan, where there's a board that can be dated to about 2200 to 1800 BCE. It's a board with a particular pattern on it. And then it gives you it describes what it is and a reference for it. So I showed you here that there are, you can see at the bottom, the sources are all linked to either where it's available digitally. So that source there is not available digitally, but you can find it at, so the link takes you to WorldCat, which is, I'm sure most people probably know what it is, but if you don't, it is a resource that will show you what libraries have a certain item near you. And then if it is available digitally, this one is an example from Haftavan Tepe in Iran, it will take you to the digital source itself. And I just want to go back. So we have also, this is the world map of all of the games that we have from around the world. So that just kind of shows you the geographical distribution of what we have. So moving on. So using the database in the Ludisoft, using the evidence that we've put in our database and identifying what it is we know about these games and putting that into the Ludi software allows us to identify, allows us to be able to come to the reconstruction process of identifying how games may have traveled between cultures and through time, and also to help us to figure out how some of the ancient rules might have worked. So to kind of underpinning this is the idea that games, as you are communicating games from one person to another, we bring in the idea of cultural transmission theory, that these ludimes are being transmitted, but sometimes as you transmit the game verbally to someone else, they can change one or more of those ludimes to suit their own play, to suit their own kind of, you know, whether to make it suit their own kind of cultural values more. And games change through time, and this has been documented many times in many ways, that different games can travel through different cultures, through many hundreds, thousands of years, and change their form and change the way they're played. So this example on the right here shows how some Maya games traveled through Mexico and then up ultimately into North America, and so sort of gradually the form of the game changes as it's passing from person to person. And so part of what we need to do is to be able to calculate the ludemic distance, we're calling it, so that's the, you know, the difference, we're quantifying the difference in the mechanisms of the games, and then identifying reasonable transmission routes between places to see, you know, whether it would be likely that two games that are similar to each other could have been in contact with one another. So to do the reconstructions, we have to have all of that kind of the ludemic distance and the kind of the connections between places kind of identified. And so what we'll do is we'll define constraints on the games to reconstruct them. So identify what it is that we know for sure is part of the game and what it is that we need to know about it, what's missing. And so we'll identify ludemes that are in our database from games that are from regions that are close to or nearby, or in some way connected to the game, the region where the game in question is played, and see if there are ludemes there that would fit in the holes that we are missing. And then use artificial intelligence to play out these hypothesized games to see if they work. So we can use the AI, we can have the AI play them hundreds of times, and then it returns metrics to us that can help us to see, how the game plays. So does the game always end in a draw, what we call drawishness? Or does the game always end in an endless loop where no one can win? Does it take a really, really long time or a really short time for someone to win? Is there a lot of bias in the game? Meaning, does one player always win and the other player can never win? So we can look at metrics like this and see if these, if the game looks like something that someone would reasonably play. And so to come up with a reasonable proposition for a game, for the way a game would be played, would maximize, would have all of the things that we know the game definitely had as part of the rules, and also have score well on these kinds of metrics that we would evaluate. So that's kind of what the project is doing. So now I'll kind of zoom in a little bit more on the Caucasus and talk about what we know of some of the games from there. So my own research in the Caucasus focused on the game of 58 holes, which appears in the ancient Near East and in Egypt around the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. The earliest game we have was found in Egypt, but it's not really much older than the other games that we know of. And because games are so rarely found in the archaeological record, I think that, it's a lot of people will say that Egypt is where this game originated, but because it's in Egypt, it's in Turkey, it's in Iran, it's in Azerbaijan, at around the same time, I don't know that Egypt is really, saying that Egypt is the origin is really a good idea. I think it would be, I think something else is going on. But anyway, the game appears and then it becomes very quickly widely popular during the 2nd millennium BCE. And what's interesting about Egypt is that it's only really played there during the 2nd millennium BCE, and it kind of disappears from the repertoire of gaming, if you want to call it that, from Egypt, during the Middle Kingdom, after the end of the Middle Kingdom and going forward. But it does continue being played in Mesopotamia and the Levant, particularly during the Assyrian Empire, during the 1st millennium BCE. And you can see here, as the game was found in Azerbaijan, I'll show you a couple more in the next couple of slides. It's found on rock surfaces mostly. So this one at Chapmala in the Gobistan Preserve is the holes are pecked into a rock surface that's lying horizontally. Others are at sites in the Absheron Peninsula, which is not too far from Gobistan. So they're all on kind of the coast of the Caspian Sea in eastern Azerbaijan. And so the arrangement of the holes, but also the lines that connect the holes, are very similar to other examples that we have from Turkey, such as this one at Kultepe, from around the same time period, from the Karam, there, the Assyrian merchant colony, and it's mostly the connections between the holes which are similar. So you have, in the central two parallel lines, you have these crossed, you have the ones that go across between the two lines. the two vertical lines of holes, you have the lines that go between. That's important to look at and to keep in mind for what's coming up. So those, you can see here on the right, the examples from Azerbaijan, and you see in at least 3 of them, the lines are preserved such that in the central 2 lines of holes, you have lines connecting the holes between them. And the one from Chapmala and from Shuvalan and Agdashkuzu on the bottom left. What's interesting about this is that it's completely different from the games that we see in Egypt. Well, I shouldn't say it's completely different, but it's very different for what gameplay would be. So the Egyptian example you see here on the left has the ordering, the number of holes. You can see, so it's been hypothesized that this game, you start on one of the holes, either 1 or 1 prime, you go down, and then you go up, and then the goal is the larger hole up at the top. That was hypothesized by Howard Carter back in the early 20th century. And then the lines connecting the holes are, you would move between the holes because of the lines connect them. We don't have an ancient rule text that tells us this. This is what made most sense to Howard Carter, and people have kind of said, yes, this seems like it would work. But what you have on this board and the Egyptian boards are 2 separate tracks for players, and the pieces would never interact with one another. So it's just a race to get to the end. But what you have here in Azerbaijan, and what you also have in nearby places like Turkey and Iran that have similar boards to what we have from the Caucasus, is that you have the connection between the 2 separate tracks. So this opens up the possibility that the 2 players' pieces do interact with each other, and that there's some other kind of gameplay going on here. So it's a different kind of, the game is played on virtually the same board, but there are things about it that indicate that there's something different about what's going on this far north than what's going on in Africa. And so, yeah, just to show you here again, the map from our website, the darker points are the older pieces of evidence. So you see the darker ones are largely in Anatolia, Egypt, and in the Caucasus, and then the games from later periods are the lighter colors. They're pretty much concentrated to Mesopotamia and the Levant. So that's most of what we know for ancient games in the Caucasus, at least in Azerbaijan. There have been other sources that have talked about some other games that have been that were played in the region. So this one, please forgive my butchering of Azerbaijani words in this, but Merikuchdu is a Mancala style game. So if anyone has played Mancala, you have holes with a number of seeds or stones in them, and you pick them up and you kind of distribute them, and you capture each other's capture counters throughout the game. This is a game of that type, which is still played in Azerbaijan. There are other similar types of this game. It was documented in the 60s by an Azerbaijani author who's talking about folklore and folk practices in Azerbaijan. It's generally a circle of holes. Can be played by up to 4 players. It's 3, and you have 3 holes per player. This one here on the bottom was at the Gobistan Preserve. It has 9 holes, so that could have been for 3 players if it was for this game. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes if something is a game or for another purpose, but this fits the pattern of what it would be like, of what Merikuchdu would be like. And there, yeah, so the Mancala style board games go back at least into the Middle Ages. From West Asia, we have Arabic sources talking about Mancala from the early Middle Ages. And there's another stone at the Gobistan Preserve, which is covered by these tamgas, these symbols you can see on the picture on the left, which dates, those symbols have been dated to the Middle Ages also. And you have 2 rows of 7 holes, which is a pretty commonly played Mancala style game in West Asia on this stone. So again, it's kind of hard to tell to date these kinds of things, but it is associated with medieval rock art here. So, it's possible that this is very old, but it could also be modern. But either way, it attests to the presence of Mancala style games in the Caucasus region. Now, chess, everybody knows, has been played in the Caucasus region for a very long time, probably since the early days that it was played. It's called shakhmat or shadraki, depending on if you're from Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Georgia. This game originates in India in the early centuries CE. It was called chaturanga there. You see here, it's a picture from a famous story from Firdausi where the Indian king challenged the Persian king to make a better game than chess, and then the Persian king makes backgammon, which we'll talk about in a second. But chess spread to Persia, which then spread everywhere throughout the Islamic world and then into Europe from there. It also spread east to China and Japan and Southeast Asia, but we won't talk about that now. Today, everybody plays the same rules of chess, basically, because we have chess federations that regulate what the rules are. And so, you have someone who says what these are, but in the past, there were very locally distinct versions of chess, such as some places in Europe, the king could move as a knight on its first move. So these are some things that have kind of been lost, and it would be interesting to see if there were, at one point in time, local versions in various parts of the world, and if they've been documented. So what we call backgammon in Western Europe is called nard or nardi in the Caucasus and in Persian speaking world as well. Is derived from an older game called Nard Shir, which is that one that was supposedly invented in response to the Indian challenge of chess from Sasanian times. But its ultimate origins are not really well understood. There's some early evidence from India and from Iran, even some in Central Asia, and some actually Roman games that seem to play similarly to backgammon and to this game. So we know this is one of the games that we don't understand the origin of very well. The version that is played in the Caucasus is similar to what is played throughout West Asia and in Greece. It's played differently from Western backgammon, where the pieces are already on the board. You have to introduce the pieces, and there are a couple of other differences as well. We also have some early modern references to some games in the Caucasus. So Thomas Hyde, who was a historian working at Oxford in the 1600s, described this alignment game that was taught to him by someone from Armenia. It's a common alignment game. Basically, you place 3 stones on the intersections of the lines, or you have 9 stones which you place on the intersections of the lines, and if you get 3 in a row, you take off one of your opponent's pieces. If you get all of your opponent's pieces off, you win. This game has been around for a very long time, and it's very popular all around the world. It's basically everywhere. So we know it in Armenia at least since the 17th century, but it also appears in Azerbaijan at Gobustan on one of the stones there in the rock art. So this motif hasn't been dated there, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to see how old this game actually does exist there. And sometimes what's interesting is this game is often placed on a vertical surface, so you can't play it on a game that's as a game on a vertical surface. So it might also have some other kind of meaning that we don't fully understand. And then I think this is the last game I'll talk about right now. This is called Tama. It's a version of checkers or drafts, which was first described in a Western language in the 1930s as a version that was played in Armenia. So basically the point of this game is, it's, if you've ever played checkers, it's kind of similar, except the fact that you move the pieces also in orthogonal, so up or down and right or left, not just diagonal directions. There's also, yeah, like it was called the Turkish game in Armenia at the time. There is a Turkish version of this, but you cannot move diagonal in the Turkish version, whereas in the Armenian one, it would be interesting to look more into the history of this game. So yeah, so that's kind of an overview of what we have done, what we're doing, what we've done so far. There's a lot more to do, and a lot more data from the Caucasus would be really interesting and really helpful. We've gotten, you know, what we can do, but yeah, more anything about games that you know from the Caucasus or sources that refer to them would be greatly appreciated. So thank you again to everybody. If you're interested in the project, you can download the software to play the games. You can check out our database. And you can also follow us on social media or email us for questions. Thank you.
You were talking about the different forms of evidence that you have, which is, you know, the physical material evidence and from books and so on. Do you find that you've got a lot more of one than the other, or is it pretty evenly?
Well, in our database, it's heavily skewed to artifacts because I am an archaeologist and I had done a lot of this research before. So I already had some artifact databases that we just imported. So, but aside from that, we have a lot of ethnographic research.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes hard to talk about things being games unless you have someone who's told you that it's a game first, right? So you find artifacts with patterns of holes or lines in them. Unless you get a lot of them that repeat over and over again, it's hard to say. You find one and you're like, okay, what is that? You know, it's hard to tell. So we're kind of, you know, that's an area for future work for sure. But yeah, I would say for ancient games, artifacts are overwhelmingly most of what we have, and then for more modern games, it's ethnographies, and then in the middle you have, you know, it's probably going to be a mixture of artifacts and literary sources.
Yeah, so it's partly a chronological thing. And you must have quite a lot on some of the games, because when you were saying that something was widely played in a particular time frame, you must have quite a lot of evidence to be able to say that.
Yeah, I mean, we have things like, for instance, Senate in Egypt, which is one of the most famous games of antiquity. We have something like 300 pieces of evidence for that.
Wow.
Mostly because I did that I did that research for my PhD. But yeah, but we also,
I think we've got a couple of questions from people. Yeah, James.
Yeah, thank you. That was really exciting, and I will almost certainly have more questions than this once I've had more time to think on it. I guess what I was wondering, you were going into how you model the kind of like preferences and constraints that you want a set of rules to come out with when you're doing these AI simulations. Do you kind of work on the principle that there's sort of one general set of those, or do you modify them at all for social contexts? When I was talking to people doing some work on kind of reconstructions of Nefertafel a couple of years ago, I remember they were saying that their framework was quite built around the principle that, you know, you had pictures of people playing this while drinking, so it shouldn't be a 3-hour game sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's something that I didn't mention it in the presentation, but some things like that are things that we are also considering in the database, like the social context of what the games are. So we're also looking at, you know, what can we tell about, you know, how people and who was playing and where they were playing. So we take into things like gender and social class and the spaces that people are playing. Are they playing at home or are they playing in public? What are the nature of those spaces and things like that, that we haven't yet, what we can do is look at, what are some of the games that we have fully documented that have, certain social contexts and social indicators, and see how those games play with the certain metrics. And so then that would give us a baseline for what we would want to look at. We haven't gotten to that yet, but that is something that, I think that's a very good, a good point. And so it also brings up the point that some of these metrics are not, universal. So some things like game length, we know from the ethnographic record that people are talking about games that go on for days. So, just because a game lasts very long doesn't necessarily mean that's a disqualifying rule set for it. So there are these kinds of considerations that we have. Yeah.
I think Ruben's got a question as well.
So thank you very much, Walter. That was very interesting. And as far as I understand, your primary goal is to create a database. Nevertheless, I would like to ask a question related to your interpretative part of your work. So you already mentioned that that it is quite complicated to say for sure where some of the games were invented, especially for the earlier periods. But anyway, I would like to ask two questions. And first, for the prehistoric board games in the Near East, Egypt or Caucasus, which tendencies do you see? Were the games transmitted via cultural diffusions, or they were rather invented independently in different regions? This would be one question. And the second is, what is the social aspect? Like nowadays, in our understanding, games are more or less connected to leisure, right? To a concept of leisure. But was it the same, or what are your meditation on this issue? Where was it the same in the Antiquity? At least for the time we have, written sources, or it has some representative aspects because of contexts and so on. So this would be my two short.
So yeah, thank you. Those are important questions and good ones. So my kind of thinking about the way that I've always kind of framed games is that playing a game is a social act. So you're, whatever the time is, and like whatever, you have leisure time and work time, but like when you're playing, you have to play pretty much all of these games. There are very few solitaire games. You have to have somebody else there with you to play them. So it's inherently a social act. What we see in prehistory for the way that are like early history, in West Asia, North Africa, so Egypt and the Near East and the Caucasus and Cyprus as well, and the Mediterranean, we see certain games at certain times become really popular throughout the region. So in the second millennium BCE, in the first half of it, we see this game of 58 holes is everywhere, and then it's gone from some places, but it continues on in other places, and then another game becomes the one. So then in the second half of, in the late Bronze Age, the New Kingdom, it's the game 20 squares becomes this popular game that's popular throughout the region. And then and then later on you get Roman games that appear everywhere, and then you get chess coming in and backgammon. What I see in this are these kind of different changing trade relations. So part of the social aspect of games is that you don't need to be able to speak the same language to be able to do it with somebody else. So there's this concept of the ludic lingua franca that exists out there, where it's a shared culture around games that can be, it can be shared over a very wide region, and it helps people to interact with one another. So so the games would probably originate in certain places, and then they gain popularity, and then for whatever reason, one becomes the popular game of the day, and then at some point it falls out of fashion, and then there's another one. And we're currently living in the time when chess is that game. So who knows, it could be something else in the future. But yeah, so this is the kind of way that I think about it. It's part of these networks of interaction where the game is kind of, they're traveling between person to person and helping people to interact with each other more easily when there are other kinds of boundaries there to it. Because playing a game is a little bit less serious, so you don't have to take into account quite as many of the social differences between people when you do it. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
If everyone's ready, I'll introduce our next speaker, who's James Baillie. And James is a PhD student in history at the University of Vienna. He previously studied at Cambridge and in Birmingham. He specialises in digital humanities and the medieval history of the Caucasus region, with particular interest in prosopography and historical data modelling for exploring social and political topics. His other academic interests include world medieval literature and texts, and the representation and digital modelling of medieval sources in computer societies in computer games, which all sounds fantastic. He convenes the Medieval Caucasus Network, which works to connect medievalist scholars of the region. And the title of James's talk is These Imagined Borders, the Medieval Caucasus Through Structured Data. So over to you, James.
Right, okay, good. Thank you very much. And I will attempt screen sharing. Okay, I should also say I have a slight sore throat going on, so if I start sounding like an emaciated frog by the end of this presentation, I apologize in advance. Okay, so yes, without further ado, the medieval Caucasus and structured data. Quite specifically, this will be very much focusing on my doctoral work. I'm looking mainly, as we'll see, at the 12th century, but hopefully some of what's going to be discussed here will be applicable to far wider contexts. This will actually move to the next slide. That will be helpful. Here we are. Right, welcome to the 12th century Caucasus. Particularly, this is a period when the Bagratione dynasty, or what is generally referred to today as medieval Georgia, is at its sort of peak point. It's the dominant regional power through this time period, certainly sort of south of the Caucasus Range proper. And that's particularly notable in Georgia's sort of power projection in this period. It is sort of one of the periods of Georgian history where Georgia is invading all of its neighbors, as opposed to the much longer periods of Georgian history where the reverse tended to be the case. So Georgian military forces, however you define that in this period, get as far east as Khorasan and as far west as the Western Pontus. So this is very much a polity that is able to throw its weight around. And of course, it's a culturally important period for Georgia, as I'm sure many of you who are from the Caucasus or familiar with its cultural history will be aware of. This is a period where you've got a lot of kind of major epic poetry and so on being produced. The typical historiography of this period in Georgian sources tends to be that it's a kind of strong monarchy period, that you have these kind of external threats from various Turkic or Perso-Turkic dynasties like the Ilbegizids, and then from the inside you have these sort of what's often presented as very kind of much a zero-sum power struggle between the monarchy on the one hand and the kind of church and senior nobility on the other. And that's the view you'll get in a lot of kind of standard works on the narratives of the period. Because of this importance, and I kind of wanted to put this early on in the presentation to sort of start you thinking about why some of what I'm about to discuss later matters so much, you get this very strong kind of Georgian Golden Age historiography about the period. That particularly tends to focus on the idea of the state and the idea of borders and expansionism. That focus on the state is to some extent a synthesis of 20th century political pressures. During the kind of Soviet period in Georgia, looking at the medieval state managed to be a sort of synthesis point where it was both acceptable to people with a more Georgian national perspective, because of the kind of Golden Age implications, but which was also acceptable to the Soviet government, who were able to see the kind of state versus nobility aspect of these presentations as a sort of acceptable way of doing medieval history. In some ways, it's quite similar to what you see in Soviet history of some other countries. When you look at the medieval stuff, there's a lot of, looking at the prehistory of the state and presenting the state as essentially the protagonist of the piece. And this has led to a kind of modern popular reception, also influenced by lots of other things. There's the fact that several of the Georgian monarchs in this period are saints. You get political references to this period by modern politicians in the region, and so on. And even outside Georgia, you get some kind of contested elements, which I won't go into too heavily in this talk, but just as a sort of relatively minor example, there is a sort of frequent back and forth over whether the Mahagadzeli / Zakarian family, do you refer to them as Mahagadzelis and say they're Georgian, or Zakarians and say they're Armenian? We'll come back to that later. So this sort of contest set leads us to some problems and questions. What does drive this unique political situation in the Caucasus in this period? And who drives it? Why are they doing it? What's knitting that socio-political structure together? And can we look at that from viewpoints other than this angle that assumes that the state is the protagonist? And can we do that in part by looking at forms of power other than those most connected to the state, the idea of formal titles, offices, and responsibilities? And can we look perhaps in a way that doesn't initially lead us through the lens of these national historiographies that tend to assert a particular position of, this is Armenian history, this is Georgian history, which can sometimes underplay the overlaps and complexities of identity. And so my suggestion is that prosopography is quite a useful tool when we're looking at those questions. For those who are unfamiliar, prosopography is the study of collected, systematized person data. Particularly, it's a term used in ancient and medieval studies. It's differentiated from sort of big modern sociological systems by the kind of scale, type, and quality of data. We're talking quite small numbers of people where we're doing things like collected career analysis. We're looking at factions and networks within elite groups. We're looking at identities. So we're looking at each person in a bit more detail, perhaps, than you might get in a big sociological study, but we're also using very mixed and complex data being pulled out of things like chronicle sources, epigraphy, inscriptions, even art in some cases, and building up that kind of slightly more difficult piecemeal historian's picture of who people were. And this, I'm going to suggest, can lead us to a bit of an alternative viewpoint by refocusing on individuals and actors. And that leads us to the core project that I am working on, the PHMG prosopography of High Medieval Georgia. It is a prosopographical database of linked data. It's built on a graph database system, and it covers people, places, and events through this time period, as well as some other node types like identities. It uses a data model. I'm not going to go too hard into the data modeling because I'm aware we're mostly humanities people here, but I'm very happy to talk about that more in questions. But it uses what's called the prosopon model, which is it's a structured set of data which form a single reading of the sources. So the data set that is put together is meant to be internally consistent. That differentiates it from models which are just saying, here's all the things the sources say about a person, but without any kind of, we think this might be true, we think this might not be true. Whereas in the model I'm using, very much it's designed to be consistent and make the reasoning for this particular reading of the collected material apparent. And it uses sort of tagging systems, so there's quite a high level of flexibility in its representations of some of these concepts. So for example, you don't just say, this person is X or Y. Often you can say, well, I'm just going to tag them as both. The data covered, current coverage is roughly 1125 to 1210, moving across multiple language groups. So particularly so far, I've primarily covered the the Georgian chronicles, covering that period. I'm working on the Armenian material at the moment, in particular Stepanos Orbelian, who wrote a chronicle of the province of Sienik, mainly. Though also there are a number of other Armenian historians who mentioned this period more briefly. And there are some important Arabic pieces of material. Ibn al-Athir is quite available. The material by Ibn al-Azraq is much less so, but actually really quite important, since he spent a couple of years working for one of the Georgian monarchs during this period. A sort of health warning on a lot of this is that because of that very wide language spread, a lot of the data are drawn from and built working with translations. I do not actually speak 8 languages, or whatever it is I would probably require. I have a moderate amount of Georgian, but so for some of the other language groups, that's a kind of caveat that has to be attached to the project. And gaps certainly remain. There's certainly more material from Shivan, some of the kind of court poetic material, which I have not been able to access versions of that I could use. And there is a huge amount of epigraphy out there. Ironically, actually, including the rather nice 12th century boundary marker stone, which you can just about make out as the background picture here. But yeah, there's a lot of that kind of evidence which would add significantly to this data and have not yet been included. We've also got some analytical tools tied to that. So there's that's looking at individual data points. So in this case, a data point might be a person, an event, a place, and simply being able to browse those and look at the reasoning on each of them can be quite important. Of course, searches are very important to find those to begin with, which lets us look at category blocks. There's mapping systems. So events are linked to places, places are geo-referenced. That's actually just time-wise a very large percentage of the work in this project is geo-referencing stuff. And that allows us to build some maps. And also it is going to be built with some chronological analysis tools, which will be designed essentially to kind of sanity check particular chronologies. So if I say, I know when this happened, and it was 4 years before this, but that was 2 years after that. And that I think must have been 3 years between the two things, but that can't be more than 1 year after that. That sort of fuzzy data, you should be able to build a set of terminus, antequem, terminus, postquem, start point, end point for each, based on that sort of fuzzy data collection. And I'm working on tools which will provide a kind of algorithmic analysis of whether there are any conflicts in a particular set of entered data of that sort. But a lot of the power of this doesn't actually come from the analytical tools. In traditional history, we have this idea of close reading, looking at sections of sources in context, supporting arguments. Then in digital humanities, we've often had this idea of distant reading come up, where you have a big scale of kind of huge corpus of text. You can look at word frequencies, entity recognition, topic modeling, and so on. But what I'm doing here doesn't really fit either of those models. Rather, it's an idea of digital close reading, working closely with text and then formalizing those systemically into a single set of cohesive data. And that's important because it allows us to challenge and formalize a lot of the assumptions we're making about what we're looking at. Whereas close reading, the power of close reading is often that it doesn't have to absolutely hammer itself down, which is good because the real world isn't like that. The downside is that that can sometimes mean that with a more traditional historical approach, it can elide or have slip under the radar some of the assumptions it is making. So the digital close reading approach forces those out into the open, as it were. So let's look at some cases of how this works in practice. And where better to start than Tamar, the most famous Georgian monarch perhaps of this period, queen from around 1184 until sometime around 1210. There's some disagreement over that date in the source material. In Georgian historiography, Tamar is often presented as this kind of singular rupture in 12th century history, as the sort of one woman who kind of breaks through and is exceptional entirely in what she's doing. But what I'm going to suggest from the work I've done with this data is that there actually might be more of a story here. So to kind of test that assertion, we can look at whether other women had power, what that looked like. And with this prismographical approach, we can actually look at basically all the cases we have across the Caucasus in this period. There still aren't many of those, which is the bad news. Under 10% of records in my data so far are women, for a sum total of 23. On the plus side, I have built in that sort of event data. So for each case we have, there's as much sort of information about what those women were doing, where they were, who they were connected to, and so on, as we can get out of the source material. And indeed, we do find that there are certainly other cases of women exercising power. And not necessarily in the ways that traditional models of the sort of medieval realm as proto-state tend to pick up. Because in typical historiographies, we tend to have this focus on what's the structure of the court, who reports to whom, who has formal power over what. And that sort of idea of articulate power, because it is specifically articulated, doesn't always cover these cases well. Instead, we can start by looking at the high mobility of women. At least 10 of the 23 people in my dataset moved or married abroad. Here rather loosely defined as significantly away from their home place or indeed home culture. And we see some very interesting examples of women acting in negotiation situations. So Khwashek Tsokali and Kravajakeli were Queen Tamar's negotiators in a coup crisis at the very start of her reign. These women were from two of the most senior noble families. And so you have this sense of their familial links, which are stressed in the chronicle material, allowing them to broker this negotiation between the queen and the rebels. And on a sort of international, to the extent that you can use that word for the period, level, we have Georgi III's wars against the Perso-Turkic ruler Eldeguz in the 1170s, where his sister Rusudan was one of the major negotiators for the subsequent peace deal. Rusudan had existing links into the Persian world via a previous marriage, and so she was the main negotiator from the Georgian side. And so what we see here is women, engaging in these very key negotiation roles, presumably in these cases because they are the best people for the job at the time, at least from the perspective of the people appointing them. But also this idea of brokerage is very important, because a broker in network theory is an actor who controls the flow of information, ideas, goods, whatever, between other actors. And a broker gains power by that. If there is a weak tie between two sets of actors, the person in the middle of the tie actually has a huge amount of additional power, because whilst they may not be the most connected into either network, they control the flow between those networks. And because of women's high mobility, we can see potential for them to have a significantly higher ability to interact in some of these brokerage situations than male counterparts did, where seeing these situations is actually much less common. And so here we kind of have a bit of a summary of that. So yes, these high mobility creates these potentials for brokerage situations. And so we have, I mentioned earlier, the idea of articulate office holding power. And so converse to that, we have this idea of inarticulate power, power that is gained not by a formal written thing saying, you have the right to do this, but power that is gained by people having particular connections, particular social status. And by using the prosopographical approach and building a picture of their careers up, we can get a picture of their power in these situations. And there's some further evidence to back up this idea. There's, interestingly, there are a number of nearby polities, including Jerusalem, but also some of the Muslim polities in the region have women rulers at the same time as Tamar. We actually get this sense of women as brokers in some of the literary work as well. In The Night in Panther Skin, the maidservant Asmat is a core broker between the protagonist and the title character. And there's another important brokerage situation where a woman called Fatman brokers a relationship between the protagonist and the sort of core damsel in the tower character at the heart of the story much later in the text. And when we look at Tamar, how she's presented in the Chronicles, there's this focus much more so than for male rulers on appointments. And we know from the work of, for example, Anthony Eastman, that her church art focuses heavily on family ties. Again, it's this, Tamar herself is built up through this idea of her inarticulate power as much as through presenting her formal status as a monarch. And so from this brief case study, we can look at a reassessment. So we've looked at these group career analyses and suggested that there's this recurrent theme of mobility, negotiation, brokerage, and a potential mechanism where feminine power could be built up in a more inarticulate way, which could be an antecedent to how Tamar is presented through our material. So let's move on to a second case. Structured data, as I mentioned earlier, can formalize assumptions and allow us to challenge them. And now we will get to look at, as the title of the talk said, these imagined borders in that light. Whilst a non-structured representation, as comes from traditional close reading, may have more freedom to describe complex phenomena, it can revert to default categorizations by not making them explicit. And so my suggestion here is that formalizing boundaries, both physical boundaries and also boundaries between categories such as identities, makes for some important comparison points and allows us to reassess some of the typical views of these. So the typical view of Georgia and its borders through this period is this idea that Georgia is this core state, it has territory, there is some line around the edge of that territory which is its border. There are then some tributary or client relationship states around it forming a sort of outer ring. So that will be, for example, Shivan, some of the small polities of the North Caucasus. But what if we didn't try to describe it in the terms that we would describe a modern state, with its nice little linear border that we can scribble onto a map? What if, rather than try to codify a set of relationships between states over particular mapped land and territory, we instead try to look at the idea of borders by observing the operations of political actors, and thereby taking a more dynamic model and saying, well, what is this political unit doing where? Why is it doing it? And who is doing it as a result of that? And I'm going to go through some examples where I think formalizing data allows us to, in some cases, point out quite simple but important points. So we go back first to David IV, David the Builder, one of the, I mean, along with Tamar, the other kind of very famous Georgian monarch of this period. You get lots of nice big maps, and you can find them on Google, of how big Georgia was by the end of David IV's reign, stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, right down across all of what's now Armenia, and so on. And because of this, David is often presented as being, you know, the conquering hero, and Demetrius and Georgi, his son and grandson, are kind of seen as the, like, not quite as good second and third season follow-ups. But I think actually reformalizing the chronology here is quite important. So there's the famous Battle of Didgori, and then the fall of Tbilisi. Armenia and Shivan are conquered a year or so after those, 1123. And David is dead by the end of 1125, which is to say, the absolute majority of land area that David expanded Georgia by during his reign was held for under 24 months at the end of his reign, which makes you wonder, particularly because it's coming very much in the aftermath of this very major military victory, what capturing territory exactly means in this case. David isn't expanding the Georgian system of governance. He literally doesn't have time to before he's dead. So and so we have to think then perhaps more carefully about what these redrawn lines, the speed at which they're drawn, mean. Particularly because, as we then see, a lot of those fall away very quickly. And that's often blamed on David's successors, basically just not being man enough to hold them. But we should actually ask ourselves whether Georgia could ever have held them in those circumstances, and you know, whether David could have made that difference is simply something that is never actually historically tested. With these Georgian conquests, the Eristaviates, the sort of ducal provinces of Georgia, are not expanded outside the kind of Kartvelian-speaking core Georgian territories at any point. Even in Tamar's reign quite late in the century, a series of border guards are listed in the chronicles, with the borders at the Mtkwari-Kura River and the South Caucasus mountain range, which is to say, excluding Armenia, even though Tamar's Georgia nominally does include a lot of Armenia, and Shivan, which is effectively a kind of allied client state sort of Georgia through this period. We're about to get onto a bit more about that. So to what extent do we have one state polity here? Or to what extent do we have a series of quite complex relationships which are quite personal, networked relationships between elites throughout the Caucasus, with certain recognitions being made in a more, almost sometimes a less formalized, less directly structured way than we might otherwise suggest. We have these claims in Tamar's reign of Tamar reigning from sea to sea. She retains the title of Shirvan Shah in her titulature. But at the same time, there is certainly a sense that what is happening here is Tamar is asserting her right of rulership without actually doing a lot with it. And the fact that she's not doing a lot with it might actually be important to the fact that she's able to claim it. The co-option of elites like the Shahs of Shirvan and some of the nobility across Armenia may be very much key to this process when viewed from a kind of actor-centric model. So, a question: who was Shah of Shirvan in 1180? It's a trick question because the answer is both Georgi III of Georgia and Aksartan, who was the actual Shah of Shirvan. Georgi III uses the title Shirvan Shah in his list of titles consistently in charters. The Georgian chronicles, and that's from the Georgian side, not the Shirvan side, also still refer to the Shirvan Shahs as Shahs of Shirvan. There is no contradiction apparently seen contemporaneously between the idea that both of these people are claimed to be the Shah of Shirvan. Interestingly, the Georgian monarchs, as well as the title Shirvan Shah, also use the title Shahanshah, the Persianate king of kings. And I think that's quite an interesting one in this light, because it suggests some conceptions of sovereignty or leadership that don't necessarily need to be reified. The issue doesn't need to be forced of who is really the Shah of Shirvan, as long as these two people are getting along well, essentially. So we have some of these borders that maybe appear when there is a test to them, when a political conflict forces the state to emerge. But before then, actually, it can be perfectly fine to, in some ways, have Schrodinger's Shah of Shirvan. You don't need to force the question of who it is most of the time, which significantly complicates this idea of where is the border of the Bagrationid polity, because it can both simultaneously be a border with Shirvan and a border that includes Shirvan, without anybody needing to force the issue of which is actually, the quote-unquote true legal border. That concept doesn't need to be in play, and so it doesn't come into play. And even within the quote-unquote Georgian borders, we can see some very interesting patterns when we look at how different actors worked. So we have a tale of three generals in Tamar's reign here. The red icons on this map, which is pulled out of the database, are David Soslan, Tamar's second husband. Blue icons are her first husband, Yuri Bogolyubsky. And the yellow items are her general, Zakaria Makhakanzeli, or Zakaria Zakarian. And it's probably pretty noticeable, but I will make it clearer if it isn't, that the Zakaria Makhakanzeli's activity is very much across the territory of what is now Armenia. That is a significant cluster there. And this guy is her Amir Spatala. He's nominally the commander of her armed forces. But where those armed forces are being commanded by him versus where command is given to her husbands is very much differentiated in terms of who is acting. And from that, we can then think maybe more clearly about why this polity is putting particular forces under particular people, and the extent to which you have across a lot of Armenia a situation where it's very much a Zakarid Makakadzeli led expansion, which is attached, of course, to Georgia, but again, where there can be sometimes these overlapping or complex understandings of the question, well, who's really in charge then? So are the Makakadzelis Armenian or are they Georgian? Yes. And that's the prosopography of high medieval Georgia approach. You can formalize the word and in the way that you look at these things. It's perfectly acceptable, in my view, to tag actors with as many different identity markers as they can validly accept. And a kind of interesting counterpoint is the Baillies, who preceded the Makakadzelis as the sort of most senior military family in 12th century Georgia, because there's some debates with them as well over, are they Georgian, are they Armenian? Then you read the Baillie Chronicle and the Baillies are like, yes, we're Chinese, which is probably a literary topos, but it does show you again that there's that complexity of identity that is easily boiled down beyond what is helpful when you start asking the question of whether we're writing Georgian or Armenian history. So these exclusive national terms clearly become anachronistic, but also they're very perspective driven. There's this principle that I think we can take when dealing with prosopographical work, which I should definitely be able to pronounce given how much of it I do, of the principle of notable difference. Basically, somebody's identity doesn't turn up unless it's notably different from the people around them. Georgians in a Georgian source are not referred to as Georgian because that's the expected norm. Ditto Armenians in an Armenian source. But Georgians in Armenia or Armenians in Georgia, you will get those things brought out much more because that difference becomes noticeable. As a British person, when I am in Vienna, the fact that I call myself European is pretty irrelevant. The fact that I'm British is very noticeable because I'm the person in the room drinking far more tea than anyone else. When I'm back in Britain, the fact that I'm British stops being noticeable. The fact that I self-consciously identify as European is, in present circumstances, quite a political statement. And I think also in this regard, getting back to Georgia, we should note that concepts of authority are often focused more on identity groups. So the Tamar or Georgi III is not written down on his documents as king of Georgia. He's king of the Abkhazes, the Kartvelians, the Kakhis, the Rans, Shevanshah, Shahanshah, etc. So in some ways, he's actually king of peoples as opposed necessarily to places, which I think is notable for how we're dealing with some of these concepts of borders and identity, and is why I think the boundaries and borderlines between identities are as important and deeply connected to those political borders we can try and fail to draw on a map. So we've seen how some of these simplistic border models break down when we represent action rather than trying to represent a nominal edge of a state. There's a wide range where Georgian power is projected to, but the complex system of co-opting elites into that system does form patterns that we can look at. And that bullet point makes less sense than it should do, for which I apologize. But the idea of where a particular state is does, I think, have some of these underlying answers, but they're much more based on a set of perceptions and the idea that these things can overlap. And so the strictness of the prosopographical data model actually in some ways demands a greater fluidity of theory, because you need the theory, you can't go around saying, I think this was the case, and then have a theory that, would exclude that. So I think actually formalizing one set of data can actually create more depth and fluidity in the interpretations. So some conclusions, since I've been rambling at you for some time now. we've seen how digital close reading, this process of taking things from chronicles and written sources and also epigraphy and so on, and then formalizing them into a single set of structured data, can challenge and problematize standard views. That greater completeness of material permits in group analyses, as we saw with children women. There are limitations, of course, of sources, language, and the limitations of the model. We've seen from that how High Medieval Georgia and the Bagrationids form the kind of core of these networks of rulership between overlapping identity groups and even in some cases overlapping territorial claims, with the importance of co-opting elites and brokering relationships, that those networks through which power is built, and how that was especially done by women, and I think also especially done by the kind of non-Cartvellian more ethnically diverse actors within that polity. And power here was often not zero-sum and was often inarticulate in nature. And finally, the kind of wider conclusions is that we can reconsider the Caucasus past by modelling recorded action in people's careers. And I think that's important for addressing the balance between statist and non-statist history. Structured data, I think, is a core part of this process, both via that digital close reading method and also via the kind of mapping and production of visualizations of patterns in our data. Thank you very much, Didi Madlama. And yeah, I really look forward to any questions you have.
Oh, thanks very much. That was so interesting, James. Fantastic. Does anyone have some questions? Ask you about sorry, it's 2:45 in the morning here, so I'm not maybe making, that's why I'm having difficulties, but I was wondering about where you sort of drew the line with who you include, like when you're looking in the sources, because I noticed that you mentioned someone from Night in the Panther Skin. So, I mean, if you say going through the chronicle, do you include everybody that is mentioned by name?
No. For my core data set, I include people who I can place within or at one degree of removal from a particular like geographical broad set of lines around the Caucasus within the time period available. So it's sort of everyone, but there's a lot of people that excludes. So things like literary figures are not included in the data set. I will, happily look at those when I'm looking for context for what the data set is discussing, but
What about folklore?
As in, do you mean
like
as in?
Say stories that mention historical characters and historical places, but they're stories,
Yeah. Again,
the one about go on.
Yeah, I don't include those because what I'm trying to build in this particular data set is much more about, what did people do and where were they when, rather than and then the kind of how are they presented layer is the contextual stuff. But yeah, I do think the folklore side of it is fascinating. I think it's particularly I think for Georgia, it's really interesting that, Rustaveli, for example, who absolutely can be in my data set because he was there at the time. But yes, he does. But Rustaveli actually does appear in his own right as a folktale character sometimes.
Yeah, that's exactly the example I was thinking of, because there's a story about him marrying the daughter of the ruler of Tamogui. Fortress, and then there's a fight with another princess from another fortress where there are still remains in southwest Georgia. So it's just very interesting, sort of semi-historical with historical figures, but that's what I was thinking about. Yeah, exactly that example. Any questions from anyone else?
Hey, first, thank you very much, Walter and James, for the interesting presentation. My question is more like opening the discussion for digitization in the Caucasus, like a more, in a broad sense, problems, and being based in Western institutions, and how really digitization, like limitations and language problems, mostly while working on the sources. And it's maybe more broadly, if we can discuss it. I know that it might take time, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can shoot first on that, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, certainly with what I'm doing, the language limitations and the source availability limitations are very significant. I think to some extent one has to. I don't think it would. I don't think it's productive if we end up saying, well, we can't do a lot of this work because it's because it's too hard, because we can't get the sources right. I think there's a lot to be said for trying to build a kind of. I like to use the phrase cycle of virtuous imperfection. You do something, and because you've put the thing out there, that gives somebody something else to knock over with their, if I've got my reading of some Arabic sources wrong, then nobody will know that I've got it wrong if I don't tell them in the first place.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that there is actually quite a lot to be said for kind of plowing on through and doing what you can with what's available. Because I think that, starts those conversations, gets those cycles moving. With digitization, I mean, yes, there is a huge amount that it would be good to have digitized. If anybody happens to have enough money to digitize a lot of Georgian epigraphic catalogs, I would very much like that. But yeah, again, I think it's a case of you do what you can, and these things are improving. Certainly from the areas I'm looking at, it does feel like more and more stuff is available online than it ever was previously. And so I think it is getting easier over time, and yeah, it's worth doing what one can in the meantime.
But did you have a field-based data collection in Georgia, or did you?
No, that's not that. Well, certainly, I mean, for this project, I mean, there is more than enough chronicle data that it's kept me occupied for the last half a decade. So, so yeah, I mean, at some point I would like to get more archaeological stuff in, but
yeah. But also one more question. The picture, which is the background picture, grabbed my attention. What is can I ask in your presentation?
Yes, absolutely. I believe it is a boundary marking stone. I think it's 12th century. It's at the Open Air Ethnographic Museum in Tbilisi. They've got a couple of them. I think one from the reign of David IV and one from the reign of Tamar. But yeah, I have a couple of pictures of it, but I have never actually had the time to go over it and try and write down the text and produce a translation. But yeah, it's one of those odd things which I don't know, this is just me as very much an outsider to the region and also not an archaeologist, but I mean, when I came across those boundary markers at the museum, I had not previously been aware that that was a thing that happened. But yeah, so I don't know how many more of those there are, or whether anybody's produced a catalogue of them anywhere. But yeah, again, it's something I'd be really interested in. But it's something, yeah, I've sort of stumbled across the physical things, but I've actually found it really difficult to find any literature that covers them in detail.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there anything you would like to add, Walter? I don't know, about your data collection and problems.
Yeah, I mean, so for me,
Considering considering I also did my data collection from Azerbaijan and how much it's difficult for the scholars to do research in the Caucasus overall.
yeah, I mean, it was for me what has been important in making some of the difficulties, like the language difficulties, and also just getting started in the Caucasus, because my doctoral research was based in Cyprus, so like I didn't have any roots in. It was just about kind of building relationships with people who will be able to, like, you know, send you a scan of something or tell you what's in an article or something that is not available digitally or even in a hard copy anywhere outside of Azerbaijan. Yeah, so that's been kind of you know, what has kind of hindered me in this is it's mostly the language, because I came to the Caucasus kind of late, so I didn't have any kind of background in it. So yeah, and I think that's especially true in Azerbaijan, which I think in the West has been less focused on, and also because the stuff where you know, why the 58 holes game that I was specifically studying in is on the east coast of Azerbaijan, which is like the one part of Azerbaijan in the Bronze Age that nobody talks about. so there was nothing out there. So, you know, it presents challenges, but it also presents opportunities in ways, I think. So, yeah, I think that's where I've gone with it so far. And, you know, for some of the other more recent games, I haven't, you know, because I'm dealing with stuff worldwide, I just haven't had the time to delve into it in the Caucasus more, the things like Nard and chess. So, yeah. That's, I think, what I have to say about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very short question. So thank you very much, James, again. And I have a really small question about the principle of notable differences you mentioned. So as far as I understood, this is not the core of your project. However, I wanted to ask that I guess I studied history and I was really fond of exactly the period of time you are focusing on, and wanted to, as far as I remember, it's not all notable houses or not all aristocratic families who see their origin in some exotic countries like China, Mongolia, and so on. Does it make sense to make like a catalog of these families or aristocratic families, both in Georgia, Armenia, and maybe also in nearby territories, surrounding territories, and see whether there are some patterns in their, let's say, in the architecture of, I mean, obviously the narrative, there are tendencies about the narrative, how they came, from where they came, but maybe there is some more than that, and especially because you are doing, you are making catalogization of historical analysis. Maybe this could be something valuable for you. Just the idea.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that would have to be a much wider project, especially given that really, I mean, if we're talking particularly sort of very far off origins like China, the Baillies are really the only case in the 12th century material that I know of from the Caucasus. So to the extent that there are more cases, I think, I mean, I can well imagine there may be more cases once you get into sort of deeper into kind of Iranian and Persian families, but you'd have to be casting a much, much wider net to get enough examples to say anything meaningful about. Which isn't necessarily to say that other families didn't have those myths, but beyond the Bagrationids and the Baillies, we've had very few examples of people writing about their own families. You know, we've got tons on the Bagrationids because they're the dynasty. For the Baillies, we have this particular chronicle of Stepanos Orbelian, but you know, we don't have an equivalent for the Grigolistses or the Suramelis or so on and so forth. So I think that probably for the Caucasus specifically, I don't think we've got a lot of data to follow up on those sorts of topoi. Whereas what I'm tending to do is focus on the, just the different ethnonyms with which people are presented, not necessarily just by themselves, but also by other people from outside. And I think a lot of the sort of more commonplace interesting stuff is the extent to which, when it comes to a discussion of religion, Zakaria Makhagadeli is suddenly referred to as Armenian because it's a Georgian source, they're all Orthodox, this guy is not. That suddenly becomes a dividing line. But then if it's a discussion of the army, it's not, nobody bothers mentioning it's a Georgian army led by an Armenian, it's the Georgian army. And for people from the outside, they probably didn't really, if you were a Muslim ruler from a bit south of Georgia, you probably didn't particularly care that the Georgian general leading the Georgian army was technically an Armenian by faith. It was still an army stomping all over your stuff. So I think that those kind of perspective shifts can mean a lot, and it's important to, I think, treat all of them as worthwhile perspectives.
Yeah, maybe I could just ask you, James, about your work with the computer games, with the medieval representations in games. Do you find there's much overlap with the two areas?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I won't launch into too much on this because I could talk for a very long time about it. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely the kind of angle I do with computer games is often looking at how the kind of code and tech representations of people matter and how code can be a historical argument in a game. So that links very directly to my work on kind of representations of people and identities in computer systems, because you get game designers dealing with the same problem and often doing it quite badly. So I think there's a lot of interesting overlap to be discussed there. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of interest. There'd be a thesis in representations of royal women in medieval game worlds, wouldn't there? It sounds like an interesting field of study as well. Oh, well, maybe anyone got anything else? Otherwise, I'll hand back to you, Gwen.
I guess Gwen is having some technical issues with her Zoom. So on behalf of our team, our heartfelt thanks to all of our guest speakers. We are very thankful for your support and contribution. And thanks to everyone who joined us, who made it even more special. And also thank you very much to you, Abby. And if you would like to give a talk in the upcoming seminar series, you are an early career researcher and would like to join the organizing committee, we are please get in touch. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Once more, we thank you so much for being a part of our growing and developing network.